They called him insane. But his madness turned the tide of the air war Panton in just 6 weeks.
January 6th, 1944. At the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, England, the war had entered its darkest equation. Inside a modest office lined with maps and fatigue, Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood silently before a wall that carried the essence of Allied air doctrine. A wooden plaque read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." He studied it for a moment, then turned to Major General William Kepner, the head of Fighter Command. "That sign," he said calmly, "is wrong." Within hours the message came down. In its place hung a new order. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. That single change marked the quiet birth of a revolution. In an instant, Doolittle had overturned 2 years of doctrine built on fear, loss, and necessity. His decision redefined the very purpose of the American fighter arm from guardian to hunter. It was not merely a change of words, but a declaration of intent. The age of defense was over. For the men who watched, the moment was baffling, even reckless. Bomber crews, who had relied on tight fighter screens for survival, saw suicide in the making. Commanders who had shaped strategy through attrition feared chaos in the skies. Yet, behind Doolittle's calm defiance lay a simple truth: the old way was unsustainable. In 1943, the air over Europe had become a graveyard of silver wings. American bombers flew deep into Germany, only to die beyond the reach of their escorts. Losses over Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Münster had bled the 8th Air Force white. Doctrine had protected no one. Doolittle, a fighter pilot turned strategist, understood what the numbers could not hide. You could not defend your way to victory. Air superiority would not come from shielding bombers, but from annihilating the enemy's ability to fight back. Historians would later call it one of the most consequential command decisions of the war, a simple act of removing a sign that changed the course of the air campaign. In that cold January morning, amid maps, smoke, and silence, Jimmy Doolittle didn't just rewrite fighter tactics. He redefined the logic of modern air warfare. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign had reached its breaking point. The doctrine was clear: precision bombing by heavily armed B-17 seconds could cripple German industry and bring the Reich to its knees. The reality was far more brutal. On October 14, 1943, 291 bombers of the 8th Air Force lifted off from English airfields for their second strike on Schweinfurt, a city whose ball-bearing plants kept the entire German war machine turning. The logic was mathematical: destroy the bearings, and tanks, aircraft, and trucks would stop moving. But mathematics turned to massacre. 60 bombers never came home. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. More than 600 airmen were killed or missing. In a single afternoon, the sky over Germany became a furnace of fire and aluminum. The cause was not courage, it was range. The American escort fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, could fly only a few hundred miles into the continent. They turned back long before the bombers reached Schweinfurt. The rest of the mission continued alone, massive, slow-moving formations exposed to the full weight of the Luftwaffe. German fighters attacked with precision born of experience. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs waited beyond the escort line, forming up in disciplined waves. Their tactics were lethal: head-on attacks through bomber formations, closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, leaving gunners seconds to react. A single 30mm shell could rip a B-17 apart. The result was slaughter. Out of every 100 men who took off that morning, barely 2/3 would land again. Survival had become statistical fiction. Crews calculated their chances with grim humor: 25 missions to finish a tour, and the odds of living to complete it less than 1 in 3. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, captured the despair in his diary. "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the border, and we fly on alone into hell. The 8th Air Force faced an arithmetic of death. Between 1942 and 1943, its casualty lists grew longer with every mission. Factories could replace bombers. America could build new aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down, but it could not replace trained crews at the same pace. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, saw the pattern emerging. By December, he issued a stark ultimatum. Unless the Luftwaffe is destroyed, the invasion of Europe cannot proceed. It was no longer about holding the line or protecting the bombers. The very strategy of daylight precision bombing was collapsing under its own doctrine. If something did not change, if the airmen continued to die at this rate, Operation Overlord, the coming invasion of Normandy, would be impossible. Out of that crisis, Jimmy Doolittle's moment on the wall began to make sense. The Schweinfurt raid had proven one thing beyond all argument: defending bombers was not enough. Victory required destroying the defenders themselves. The crisis at Schweinfurt had exposed a fatal truth. Bravery alone could not win the air war. The 8th Air Force possessed courage in abundance. What it lacked was reach. Every bomber that crossed into Germany did so with the knowledge that its escorts would soon turn back, leaving it to fight alone. Then, in November 1943, a new shape appeared over the English skies: long wings, sleek fuselage, and the glint of a polished spinner. The North American P-51 Mustang had arrived. It was not a miracle born overnight, but the product of engineering evolution and an unlikely partnership. The Americans had built the airframe. The British had given it a heart, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, license built by Packard in the United States. Together, they produced something extraordinary: a fighter that could escort bombers to Berlin and back without refueling. With its drop tanks attached, the Mustang could fly more than 1,600 miles, cruise at over 430 miles per hour, and still fight at 40,000 feet. At those heights, where most engines gasped for oxygen, the two-stage supercharged Merlin thrived. For the first time in the war, American bombers had a companion that could go all the way. Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group described the revelation in his combat report. The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we can take the fight anywhere the bombers go and win. But technology alone would not end the slaughter. Range was only the beginning, doctrine was the barrier. Under existing orders, even the Mustang was shackled. Fighters were to remain close to the bombers, always visible, always reactive. They could engage enemy aircraft, but only long enough to chase them off before returning to formation. It was a strategy built on fear, not initiative. German pilots could dictate the battle where to strike, when to withdraw, how to regroup. The Americans, confined to defense, could never seize momentum. The Luftwaffe still owned the skies. Jimmy Doolittle understood what few dared to say aloud: a perfect machine was worthless without the freedom to use it. The Mustang's capabilities demanded a new philosophy, one that valued aggression over caution, offense over defense. In the bitter winter of 1943, as weather-grounded missions and men waited in frozen barracks for the next call to fly, Doolittle studied the data, the losses, and the limits of doctrine. He saw in the Mustang more than a fighter. He saw a weapon capable of changing the trajectory of the entire war. By the time he assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he carried with him not just a new aircraft, but a new idea. The key to survival was not protection, it was destruction. High Wycombe, January 1944. The war room of the 8th Air Force lay buried beneath layers of concrete and cigarette smoke. Maps stretched across the walls, their red pins marking losses like open wounds. Around the table sat men who had survived the attrition of 1,943 commanders, who had seen the Schweinfurt disaster, the empty bunks, the daily telegrams home. At the head of the table stood Jimmy Doolittle. His reputation was built on audacity, the man who had once flown twin-engine bombers off a carrier deck to strike Tokyo. But this morning, the stakes were far greater. He began quietly. "The problem isn't courage," he said. "It's math." Fighter escorts, he explained, had been confined by outdated doctrines, staying close to the bombers, reacting instead of attacking. The Germans dictated every engagement. "We must take the fight to them," Doolittle insisted. "Not over our bases, not over the channel, but over theirs." Then came the order that froze the room. Fighters were to abandon close escort. They would fly far ahead of the bomber stream, up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles wide, hunting the Luftwaffe before it reached the bombers. And when the bombers turned for home, the fighters would not return with them. Instead, they would dive to low altitude, strafing airfields, trains, and fuel depots. It was a complete reversal of logic. The bombers would no longer be protected, they would be used as bait. Colonel Don Blakeslee of the 4th Fighter Group understood immediately. "This is what we've been asking for," he told his men. "Freedom to hunt. We're no longer shepherds guarding sheep, we're wolves." But among the bomber crews, fear turned to outrage. To them, the order sounded like abandonment. They imagined themselves flying into Germany alone, watching their escorts vanish over the horizon. Many believed the general had lost his mind. Doolittle accepted the criticism in silence. He knew the risks. For 2 years, the Allies had fought the air war by rules written to limit losses and had nearly lost the war because of it. His plan was simple, brutal, and unforgiving. Destroy the Luftwaffe before it could destroy them. When the briefing ended, the officers filed out slowly, their faces pale in the dim light. Outside, winter winds swept across the English countryside. In hangars across East Anglia, ground crews fueled the new P-51 Mustangs and painted their squadron codes on the wings. Within weeks, those aircraft would carry out the most radical test in the history of aerial warfare and prove whether Doolittle's reckless order was genius or madness. The skies over Western Europe were quiet for most of January 1944. Storms swept across England, grounding both bombers and fighters. The new order remained untested, a theory written in smoke and silence. Crews waited in damp barracks, listening to the rain beat against tin roofs, wondering if the Doolittle doctrine would save them or destroy them. Then, on January 29th, the weather broke. Over 800 bombers climbed into the clear, frigid air, bound for Frankfurt. For the first time, their escorts, the new P-51 Mustangs, were not tethered to their wings. They raced ahead, climbing to 28,000 feet, spread wide across the German frontier. They were not there to defend, they were there to hunt. Near Bonn, radar operators in Germany watched with confusion as formations of American fighters appeared where no bombers yet flew. Moments later, 50 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds scrambled to intercept climbing in tight formation, heavy with fuel and ammunition. They expected the usual slow-moving bomber columns. Instead, they found the hunters waiting. The engagement lasted barely 8 minutes. The Mustangs dove from altitude, their advantage total speed, position, surprise. 13 German fighters were shot down. 2 Mustangs limped home damaged, but none were lost. The rest of the German formation scattered before reaching the bombers. Further north, Colonel Don Blakeslee led the 4th Fighter Group into another battle over Cologne. He later called it the cleanest fight we ever had. "We caught 20 Focke-Wulfs forming up to attack," he wrote in his report. "They were slow, climbing, heavy. We had the sun behind us. We hit them hard, 11 down before the rest even saw us. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter." The bomber crews over Frankfurt saw something they hadn't witnessed in months' empty skies. The swarms of German interceptors that had once torn through their formations never appeared. Only scattered attacks, brief and desperate. For many crews, it was the first mission completed without massive losses. In command rooms across England, intelligence officers read the after-action reports with disbelief. The change in tactics had worked and worked instantly. For the first time, American fighters dictated the battle. They weren't reacting to the Luftwaffe, they were erasing it. News of the victory spread quickly through the airfields of the 8th Air Force. Fighter pilots spoke of freedom, bomber crews spoke of survival. And in London, analysts studying German radio traffic noted a chilling detail. Luftwaffe formations were hesitating to engage. Doolittle's gamble had paid off at least for one day, but he knew the real test was yet to come. In the weeks ahead, the Americans would bait the Luftwaffe into the largest air battle in history, a campaign designed not merely to win the sky, but to annihilate the German fighter force completely. That operation would soon have a name whispered through briefing rooms and mess halls alike. Big Week, February 1944. The snow had begun to melt across the English countryside, revealing muddy runways and the relentless pace of preparation. In every hangar, bombers were being armed not for a single mission, but for a campaign. The operation's code name was Argument, though airmen would remember it simply as Big Week. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, had designed it as bait. The plan was audacious. American bombers would strike aircraft factories across Germany, Regensburg, Brunswick, Gotha, Schweinfurt, targets so vital that the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to defend them with everything it had. The goal was not to destroy buildings. It was to destroy the fighter force that protected them. On February 20th, the skies cleared. Over 1,000 bombers rose from bases in England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters. It was the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Across Germany, radar screens lit up with panic. Over 900 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept. The battle that followed stretched from the Ruhr to Leipzig, from sea level to 40,000 feet. German ace Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter pilot of the war, watched the formation pass overhead. "This is not a bombing raid," he told his squadron. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse." He was right. For the first time, American fighters were unleashed, no longer tied to bomber boxes, no longer limited by doctrine. Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept far ahead, diving on German formations as they climbed to attack. They struck airfields, railways, and fuel depots. They shot down aircraft before they could form up, and strafed those that never left the ground. On that first day, the Americans lost 21 bombers and 4 fighters heavy, but far from catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 50 aircraft and nearly 40 experienced pilots. In the brutal arithmetic of war, those numbers were decisive. Germany could replace airplanes. It could not replace men. For 5 more days, the battle raged. When weather allowed, bombers came in waves, striking new targets each morning, forcing the Luftwaffe to respond again and again. Every sortie cost the Germans more of their irreplaceable veterans. Major Heinz Baer, a 200 victory ace, wrote in his diary, "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. They attack as we form up. They attack as we land. They attack as we refuel. There is no escape." By February 25th, Big Week was over. The numbers told the story. 226 bombers and 28 escort fighters lost, but over 350 German aircraft destroyed, 100 pilots killed, and dozens more wounded or captured. Many of those killed were commanders and instructors, the backbone of the Jagdwaffe. The result was irreversible. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe had suffered the kind of attrition that no air force could sustain. For the first time, the Germans could not mount large-scale counterattacks. Their airfields were burning, their training units decimated, and their skies swarming with enemy fighters. Big Week was not just a victory. It was the turning point, the moment when the balance of air power tilted permanently toward the Allies. What Doolittle had begun with a single order in January was now reshaping the war itself. The Luftwaffe still existed, but it was broken, exhausted, outnumbered, and bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. And as March approached, the next phase of the campaign loomed: the final destruction of Germany's fighter force. carried out not over factories or supply lines, but over its very capital. Berlin was next. By March 1944, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Reich. Big Week had gutted the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, leaving empty hangars and silent airfields where squadrons once formed in proud precision. Yet on paper, Germany still appeared strong. Its factories were producing over 1,000 new fighters each month, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rolling off the assembly lines faster than ever before. But the numbers lied. What Germany had in machines, it had lost in men. In 1943 alone, nearly 3,000 fighter pilots had been killed, wounded, or captured. Those who remained were stretched thin, flying multiple missions a day with no rest, no replacements, and dwindling hope. Letters and diaries from the front paint a picture of exhaustion. Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot, wrote to his brother, "The new boys last 3 or 4 missions, then they die. They cannot fly in formation, they panic under attack. We veterans must protect them and die doing so." Training hours had been slashed to the bone from 250 hours before combat to barely 150. Some late-war pilots entered battle with less than 50 hours of flight time. By contrast, American pilots averaged 450, with 250 of those in their actual combat aircraft. The result was predictable. Skill, not courage, became the decisive factor. The first major test came in March 1944. The target was Berlin, the heart of Nazi power. On the 6th, 730 American bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, roared toward the capital. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to respond. Over 150 German fighters rose to meet them, many flown by inexperienced replacements. The battle stretched from the Rhine to the outskirts of Berlin, a swirling chaos of vapor trails and gunfire. When it was over, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans had lost more than 160 aircraft and, far worse, nearly 70 seasoned pilots. Those numbers broke the back of the Jagdwaffe. One squadron commander wrote bitterly in his log that night, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We fought with everything we had, and it was not enough." In the following months, attrition became annihilation. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighter pilots, a quarter of its entire force. 8 aces with more than 100 victories each were killed or captured. Training units were stripped to fill combat gaps, leaving classrooms empty and runways quiet. Fuel shortages worsened the collapse. By April, many bases received only enough aviation fuel for a handful of sorties. Mechanics cannibalized damaged aircraft to keep a few flying. Even those that could take off often aborted for lack of fuel or ammunition. In the air, the difference was visible. Once disciplined formations of German fighters now broke apart at the first sign of contact. The veteran leaders, the men who had once dictated the tempo of air battles, were gone. Their replacements, barely out of training, were dying faster than the Luftwaffe could print their names on orders. The collapse was not sudden. It was a slow suffocation. Each mission drained what little remained of Germany's aerial strength, and with every returning American raid larger, faster, deadlier, the Luftwaffe's response grew smaller and more desperate. By May 1944, Doolittle's strategy had achieved what years of bombing could not. The Luftwaffe was broken not by destruction of its factories, but by the systematic extermination of its pilots. For the first time since 1939, the German skies were empty, and soon those clear skies would open the way for the greatest invasion in history. Spring 1944. The Reich was still building airplanes faster than any nation in history. Tens of thousands of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rolled from its factories, but most would never fire a shot. Fuel stocks were collapsing, airfields were in ruins, and the few surviving veterans were flying until exhaustion blurred the sky. The Luftwaffe was an empire of empty cockpits. In April, Allied reconnaissance reported an astonishing fact. Fighter strength over Germany had fallen below 60% of January levels. The veterans who had haunted the skies 6 months earlier were gone, replaced by boys with barely 50 hours in the air. Against them came waves of American Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightning's pilots trained, rested, and flying with confidence that bordered on inevitability. The raids intensified. Oil refineries, rail junctions, and marshalling yards burned day and night. On May 8, 1944, nearly 900 bombers and more than 700 escort fighters struck targets deep inside Germany. Not a single German interceptor rose to meet them. For the first time, the sky over the Reich was uncontested. General Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter force, sent a message to Hermann Göring that day. "The fighter arm is destroyed. We have aircraft, but no fuel. We have pilots, but most cannot fight." When Doolittle read the intercept, he knew the air war had turned. The strategic equation that had once favored Germany was gone. The Allies now possessed something no army could march without: control of the air. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, the full weight of that supremacy was revealed. Allied aircraft flew more than 14,000 sorties over Normandy in 24 hours. Fighters prowled the beaches, bombers shattered bridges and convoys, and every German column that moved in daylight was attacked within minutes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding in France, wrote to his wife 4 days later, "The enemy owns the sky, our troops cannot move, our supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, the invasion beaches cannot be held." He was right. In 6 months, the transformation had been absolute. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe had been winning the battle of attrition, bleeding the bomber offensive white. By June 1944, it was gone, shattered by relentless pursuit, stripped of its leaders, its airfields burning, its pilots dead. The invasion of Europe succeeded not merely because of armies and ships, but because one general had dared to reverse the logic of air warfare. Doolittle's reckless order had delivered the most valuable asset of all: freedom to fight, unopposed, beneath an open sky. The last phase of the war would now unfold under that clear, Allied-dominated heaven. The Luftwaffe's fall was complete, but its legacy of courage, sacrifice, and fatal adherence to outdated doctrine would linger as a warning written across the clouds of 1944. Summer 1944. The Luftwaffe still existed in name, but not in force. It could build fighters by the thousands, yet had no pilots to fly them, no fuel to train them, and no time to recover. The once feared German air arm, the weapon that had conquered Poland, crushed France, and terrorized London, was now a shadow drifting over a lost war. For the Allies, the transformation was staggering. In less than 6 months, the 8th Air Force had reversed the kill ratios that once favored Germany. In late 1943, American bombers had been destroyed at a rate of 20 for every German fighter lost. By the summer of 1944, the numbers had flipped. American fighters were killing German aircraft at 4-1. By the final year of the war, that figure would reach 7-1. The reason was not industrial output alone, it was philosophy. Doolittle's order had turned air strategy from passive defense to aggressive extermination. The first duty of a fighter was no longer to guard, it was to hunt. The lesson spread across every Allied command. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in the jet age that followed, air superiority would forever be defined not by how well one defended bombers, but by how completely one destroyed the enemy's ability to fight back. Yet the victory came at a terrible cost. More than 26,000 American airmen died over Europe, more than the entire Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force alone suffered 47,000 casualties. The young men who flew those missions knew the odds and climbed into their aircraft anyway. Their courage gave shape to Doolittle's vision, turning theory into victory. For Germany, the price was annihilation. By 1945, over 4,000 Luftwaffe fighter pilots had been killed, including nearly every ace who had once dominated the skies. Factories still produced 36,000 aircraft that year, but most never left the ground. In the words of Major Erich Rudolpher, one of the few surviving aces, "We had airplanes, even jets, but no pilots left to fly them. The Americans had killed them all in the spring." History would come to judge Doolittle's decision as one of the most consequential acts of command in World War II, not because it was complex, but because it was correct. In removing one sign from a wall, he had reversed an entire doctrine. That sign, the old wooden plaque from General Kepner's office, now hangs in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Beside it, the replacement reads, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy enemy fighters." Together, they mark the moment air warfare changed forever. Reporters who covered the war later tried to describe it. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, who flew missions as a correspondent for Stars and Stripes, wrote, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us. When they flew close, the Germans attacked anyway. When they flew ahead and hunted, the Germans couldn't reach us. The best defense was a good offense." By the end of 1944, that truth was beyond debate. Air supremacy over Europe was complete, the invasion of France had succeeded, and the once invincible Luftwaffe had been erased from the sky. Jimmy Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946, honored by allies and enemies alike. In later interviews, he reflected on that January morning in England. "Changing fighter tactics was the hardest decision I ever made. It looked reckless, but defending never wins, war's attacking does." He was right. From the moment that sign came down, the fate of the Luftwaffe was sealed. 6 months later, the sky was empty. The transformation was not just tactical, it was philosophical, a shift from fear to initiative, from defense to domination. The war for Europe's skies was won not by building more planes, but by daring to fight differently. That was Doolittle's genius, mad to some, inevitable to history.